Well, I introduced myself again, but yeah, Jackie Gibson from North Carolina State University, it's the flagship engineering school, kind of like Montana State here, and then UNC Chapel Hill is the flagship liberal arts and medical school, but has a few environmental engineers, so I've actually worked at both places. So my colleague, Andrew George, has a really important role. He is the community engagement coordinator for a major NIH-funded research program at UNC Chapel Hill that aims in part to assist communities relying on private well water. So Hurricane Helene, anybody remember that news? Big news. Was anybody from an area that was hit by the hurricane? In the back. Oh, okay. Well, Hurricane Helene was a really big surprise. It really hit the mountains of North Carolina, an area where there's actually many climate change refugees, including I ran into folks who had purchased a bike shop in this small town in the mountains of North Carolina after Hurricane Katrina. They'd owned one in New Orleans, and they never wanted to be hit again. And their bike shop was wiped out by this hurricane. So it was really, really unprecedented. This is a picture of a town of Spruce Pine right after the hurricane, totally flooded. The water treatment plant is underwater. And this is in a county that we're going to be talking about a little bit today, Mitchell County. So there you can see from the destruction, lots of infrastructure was destroyed. Really tens of thousands of people were without potable water for an extended period of time. And even those with community service in the city of Asheville, which has a community water system, their system was completely wiped out by the hurricane and was offline for 53 days. When it went back online, folks still didn't trust to drink it. So there's just a picture of somebody picking up some water from a water tanker. Folks were relying on hauled water for a long time. So anyway, Andrew and I are part of a team that wanted to step in and look at, because again, there was this fear around even when the water was back online, what was the quality of this water in the months after the hurricane? So I am the lead for North Carolina State University. It was a collaboration between the two universities. Even though we're basketball rivals, we get along. And Andrew's here to represent the UNC team. So we had two objectives. One was to measure drinking water quality and also access in households to see, are there still folks maybe on private systems that still their system was damaged and they don't have access again. And then, so our first objective was just to identify people's concerns in the area and then engage with local partners and set up community advisory boards. And then our second objective was to go out and test and see what the water quality was like. And I'm going to turn it over to Andrew for the next few minutes, and then I'll take over from him. He has to run and catch a plane, so I'll finish this out.
Hi, good morning. Andrew George, UNC Superfund Research Program. It's been a great conference. This is my first time. I think I was online at some point and saw some work, but it's been an amazing experience. I just want to say that I've been to a lot of Superfund program research conferences and annual conferences and NSF, and I've learned more from this one weekend than I have from all of those, and I'm not exaggerating. And I look forward to building some of this work and helping kind of build synergy with the SRPs and some of the other work. As Dr. Gibson mentioned, I work with the CEC, the Community Engagement Core of the UNC SRP. A lot of acronyms, I apologize for the alphabet soup, but what it basically boils down to is we work on private wells. We have, over the last decade, sampled about 20 different communities with 50 to 250 wells. So we sampled thousands of wells over the state. And so I'm going to tell you about the work that we did in Helene with this particular team. I point backwards, right? Awesome. So this is kind of the snapshot to the end. We had, after the study was kind of stood up and we had some of the scientists help us pull this together to kind of address this unique catastrophic event. I'll be telling you about how we got to 123 samples, and how I'll talk a little bit about the recruiting and the sampling and how we reported back, and then I'll give you a quick snapshot or example of how we reported the lead results back and how we emphasized health-based standards and also addressed times when there are low levels of some of these contaminants. First and foremost, though, whenever we do our work, we always anchor it with a community-based organization or multiple organizations. In Asheville, fortunately, we had some long-standing relationships. I lived there in the 90s, and so we had some NGOs that were still part of our teams, and that we kind of brought them in onto the project. We also worked really closely with public water utilities because, as Dr. Gibson mentioned, there was a lot of questions about the public water. Local health departments, we always work with local health departments wherever we are. They are amazing. Not only do they have networks in the communities, but they understand this well problem probably better than any other agency that I've worked with. Maybe the cooperative extensions are close. North Carolina Division of Public Health, Mr. Mize back there, go Tar Heels. He was also on the board. We also had some academics from the affected region, and then some others. The most important stuff that we got from the board before we started, it was like I was on a call with Wilson. I'm like, hey, we're ready. We want to come. It was a couple months after it was starting, or people were starting to kind of dig out. He's like, Andrew, just slow your roll. They're still digging out. Many of these homes are not. They don't even have wells. Like, the wells got washed away. So let the recovery moment happen. Gave us some time to think about the research that we wanted to do, which also included not also slowing down, but also thinking about springs. And I've really been interested in hearing some of these spring conversations. First time that we've ever incorporated springs into our study. Like I said, we incorporated public water. Anybody done a public and private well initiative at the same time? I'll explain how that's a little challenging. We also incorporated a participatory science mold science collection process where we gave citizens mold kits that they put these Petri films out and they collected mold. I won't get into that, it's way too many details, but I'll tell you that it was interesting. It kind of goes along with other citizen science, participatory science opportunities. You can give these folks the same kind of bottles and kits with these mold things. However, there are no standards, so what do you tell people when you have mold? You can't tell if it's good mold or bad mold. And then cleanup is a nightmare. And then actually isolating the different molds and seeing if there's DNA that points to a certain mold or another was actually problematic for our scientists. They started getting sick, even with respirators. So maybe next year I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But for now, let me just go and swoop back into the Community Advisory Board, who really were helpful in kind of focusing us where the work was most needed, which meant in Mitchell County, you can see in the darker areas of purple, where we concentrated a lot of our sampling. In Buncombe County, the same thing. They were telling us you need to be over in the eastern part of the county, Swannanoa, which before these, we had all the maps and the GIS designs. We were already seeing that the local knowledge was lining up with what the science showed later on. Recruiting, we've all heard all different kinds of recruiting. I'm not going to go into the details, but one of the things that I wanted to emphasize, and I have a little show and tell, is straight up simple postcards. They're super cheap, they're super easy. You put the recruiting information, a survey that allows people to sign up right there on the card. You can focus it on areas that you definitely want to recruit, and then you kind of saturate the rest of the area with online materials. It was super helpful and allowed us to reach these communities that maybe didn't have internet. Maybe we're still recovering and trying to get online, or just didn't have the literacy skills. I think half of Americans can only read up to the 5th grade level. So there's some opportunities to reach people with different networks. Participatory sampling. So be careful what you wish for. We were all excited because all these great, amazing teams came together. We have been talking, there's actually this thing called the North Carolina Well Water Working Group, which I'd love to kind of connect y'all with, which is basically academics similar to this, academics, practitioners, health department folks. We've all said we want to do more sampling because we tell people, hey, your water's clean from lead, but what about these other PFAS, pharmaceuticals, pesticides, bacteria, radiologicals, on and on and on. So this was kind of our first attempt at kind of a comprehensive sampling design. And then not even on here is the mold, which was also important. But the problem that we ran into, it was just a logistical nightmare, like trying to get certain bottles from certain areas deep in the mountains where they were still recovering. Some of the roads were still down. Had to get them to the lab in 24 hours. Had to be frozen. Had to, be kept out of the sunlight. So it was interesting, but we were able to pull it off. And the participatory science side of it, the citizen science element of it, made it possible. We could not have gotten to all these homes, sampled the water at 6 in the morning before they started using the water. So we were able to get first draw samples, which allows us to get better analysis of the lead, which I'll talk about in a second. In addition to sending out these postcards, which allows people to sign up into the study, which basically means, we ask them, do you have a well? Are you over 18? Do you live in the area of concern? And then have you tested? What kind of treatment system do you have? A little bit of demographics. But then the big one is, can we test your well? Once they finished that survey, they're also completing consent language that protects their data. Universities have these IRBs. I'm sure there are other institutions that have similar kind of protections, but it's really important for us because people will more likely work with us if we protect their data. It doesn't go public. We have been subpoenaed by the largest energy industry in the country and others who have tried to get our data, and we've successfully protected it, so we continue to kind of lean on that. We also, we do it for free, and also we're Carolina, NC State, so people trust us, so they know that we're trying to sell them something afterwards. We also had a HY survey, which Dr. Gibson's going to talk about, post-participatory survey, which is basically evaluation. Okay. I'm not going to go through the demographics too much, but just note that the public water, private well, and spring was kind of nicely divided. Aside from all the numbers, the demographics basically understand that we had a pretty good representation of the population in our sample, same kind of race, demographics, income, et cetera, except for, anybody want to guess? We skewed higher toward 6, 7, 8. That's 8 seconds. I got to do that for a class. Education. Right? More people who can understand the problem, who can, have environmental health literacy, understand that I need to get out there and get the sample, or unfortunately, in most community-engaged research projects, generally skewing those kind of groups. So most of the studies you see out there are generally skewed in that direction, not screwed, but skewed. There's that. Oops. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the results. There's some kind of good news and bad news. The good news is that when we looked at all the results, we didn't see any kind of huge catastrophic plume of one kind or another. In fact, compared to some of the background data on the metals, and we don't have a lot of background data on the rest of the stuff, but on the metals, it was actually relatively clean compared to the rest of the state, which was a great kind of opportunity to share with the participants. The biggest feedback we got was this just gave me a really good peace of mind, but there were some concerns. And so when I show you some of these results, first thing I want to emphasize is that we leaned on health-based standards. Why? Because they're health-based. Yes! So there are some standards that we didn't rely on that were health-based, that were MCLs, but most of our standards are called 2L groundwater standards. They're all driven by health. They're all kind of focused on health. They don't do this compromise that MCLs do, although the action level for lead during this time dropped from 15 to 10, which is great. Now, it's not implemented, right? It's not on the books, but it's what the scientists say is the most protective at this point, the default. So we went in and we moved toward 10 in reporting our results. But even 9 parts per billion of lead is a problem. So I'll show you how we kind of tackled that. Then I'll also go into how we went around the challenges of reporting public water. So here's some of the main results. This is a slide that we reported to our community. Lots of data on here, but you'll notice that we kind of sent out do not drink letters if they were above a drinking water standard, a 2L standard. We also cautioned people if they were below 10 parts per billion for lead or arsenic. And you'll look over there, if you notice, the arsenic, the yellow there, are about 7 people who had arsenic above 0.5 and below 10. Like some people had 2.3. So we wanted to caution them. Same thing with lead. All that yellow are people who had cautions. I'll talk about that in a second. And then the other yellow that's on the graph represents where somebody was above a standard but were on public water. So they were technically meeting federal standards, but they were not meeting the state standards. And we weren't really sure what to do, and so we went to the public health water people, and we were like, water utility, here's what we got, what should we do? And they were like, you can't tell them to stop drinking their water. So what we said was, okay, well, you're meeting the federal standards, but we recommend treating your water and considering treating your water. And that's what the health department was happy with. We were happy with that. So that's kind of what we went with. So overall, like I said, we had about 25% of the participants exceeding a groundwater standard. Very few, maybe like 4 or 5% exceeded an MCL. Most of the public water was relatively clean because it's supposed to be cleaned, and by this time they were able to get their water up online. Private wells and springs were consistently more contaminated, and one of the things that was clearly problematic was lead. So this is a slide that we share with folks at the report back meetings. You'll notice that we do have the action level for 10. If you were above that, which is the best standard that we have, actually the 2L standard for the state is also, actually the 2L standard is still 15. They haven't caught up to the federals. So we defaulted to the 10. We do the 2Ls for the rest. But if you're above a 2L, or the action level, we said don't drink your water. If you were one of those people in those dots in that interim level, we told you to consider treatment, which is important because about 40% of the people in our study had lead above 2 parts per billion. And as we learned from Dr. Wolf, 1 part per billion, especially with children in the house, we had like 33 of the homes had children in their homes. We wanted to kind of emphasize the importance of treating this water, even if it had low levels of lead. So that's kind of the main emphasis of the work that I wanted to share. Right now we're about to kind of do similar work on biosolids. So kind of right now, actually I have to get back tomorrow morning at 8. I'm collecting a sample from somebody that's sampling biosolids. So I just wanted to really quickly pitch all the conversation we've been hearing about biosolids and PFAS has been really awesome. So thanks for maybe continuing that. I'll pass it off to Dr. Gibson. It's been a great weekend. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. All right, thanks for kicking us off, Andrew. This is a really fun project to work on. We had a tiny budget, really funded by a small pilot program that's available through the 2 universities together. So we did a fair amount of work for almost no money. So that is mainly what limited our sample size. But before moving on, so when I was at the University of Illinois, not knowing that I was overlapping with Steve, I did take all of the process engineering courses for water and wastewater treatment plants. And I must say that I didn't appreciate those courses enough at the time, or that knowledge. And the reason I want to point that out is because here on this chart you're seeing on the left with the black dots, those are public water systems, and then the purple are private wells, and the blue are springs, and you just see across the board much lower lead in the public water systems, despite some terrible events that have occurred in some places. Does anybody know why that is? Corrosion control. So public water systems under the lead and copper rule are required to monitor lead and copper throughout their distribution system. And if the levels exceed a certain amount, then they have to implement corrosion control and make sure it continues to work. So whereas, as we all know, private well owners and those on springs, certainly very few people have corrosion control systems. I think I saw a slide earlier, maybe from one of the Virginia people, where they had done a survey of what treatment systems they had, and only a few % had an acid neutralizer, which is a form of corrosion control. So I'm going to go on and talk about the other things we looked at. From a public health perspective, again, we don't want to see microorganisms in our drinking water that might be associated with fecal contamination. Oops. And so we looked at measures of bacterial contamination. We looked at 3 measures. The first is total coliform bacteria, which most of you know about. It's just a general measure that indicates potentially some vulnerability to fecal contamination from humans or animals. It's a signal. Here again, I want to point out there was 1 positive in a public water system, a whole bunch in the springs. And all of these spring systems were in one of the 2 counties, Mitchell County. I wanted to just point out, we selected the 2 counties to really represent sort of different demographics. Buncombe County is where Asheville is located. Asheville's a pretty big city. It's a much higher income county, much more educated county. Mitchell County is a very low income rural county. And that's where there were a number of people that relied on private springs, or on spring systems. So only 1 public water sample had any detectable total coliforms. 27% of the wells did, 71% of the springs. Now, there's no standard, obviously, for total coliforms. It's an indicator, but we did recommend to anybody that had detectable E. coli, any detectable E. coli, to not drink their water. And you see one particularly high hit on a spring-fed systems and a couple of hits on the private wells as well. So among these, again, public water systems, why are there no E. coli in the public water systems? Disinfection, yay, okay. I read there's a really interesting study out there that credits, so in the first 40 years of the 20th century, life expectancy in the US increased by 16 years. And some economists did a really neat study maybe 2 decades ago, and they estimated that half of that gain in life expectancy was just due to the establishment of water treatment systems, filtration and chlorination systems in cities and towns. So, you know, public health 101, environmental engineering 101 for me is making sure our water is microbiologically safe. And you can see the community systems are doing their job there. We also tested for a whole bunch of the emerging contaminants that John talked about the other day. And I want to say, these are the results, and our policy was to recommend that people not drink the water if any of the results exceeded. There's new federal standards for PFAS in drinking water that cover just a handful of PFAS. And 2 households, both in Buncombe County, which is the more populous county, both on private wells, exceeded those standards. Our recommendation was that if any PFAS were detected, that people consider treatment. But what you'll notice is out of all of the 130-ish samples, what was our total number of samples again? 123. Just over 20 had any detectable PFAS at all, which is really a much lower detection rate than we see in the eastern part of the state that I talked about yesterday. So in public water, 11 of the households, or 28%, had detectable PFAS. 53% had of the private wells did, and 14% of the springs. Again, just 2 of the wells, both in Buncombe County, had PFAS, and they were both, in both cases, just barely above the standard. I did want to say one thing, too. The total PFAS that we measured were so much lower. In the eastern part of the state, in my other study, for example, the maximum sum of all the PFAS we found was well over 1,000 nanograms per liter. And here in this study, the very highest sum of all the PFAS was 45. So much, much lower. And there were only 3 households that even had more than 10. So orders of magnitude lower, and that really just reflects, again, that the mountains of North Carolina are much less affected, fairly rural. There's not major biosolids spreading sites or manufacturing activities going on there. We also looked at pesticides and pharmaceuticals. Of the ones we looked at, only 5 have health-based guidelines, and these were found really in trace amounts. And what I'm showing here is the 5 that have a health-based guideline. John, if he's still here, would know a lot more about these contaminants and their uses than I do. But even the highest result, for example, if you look at that top one, the standard is 4,000 parts per trillion. The absolute highest we found was 150. So not a whole lot of concern about emerging contaminants. So my takeaway is it's really the kind of traditional contaminants of public health concern that were most concerning in these communities. Okay. So I want to talk about the survey also. Again, because people lost water for a period of time, we just wanted to see, did people have reliable access to running water? And there's a survey that's been developed for use around the world to measure what's called water insecurity. It's got a battery of questions about all these different things: worry, ability to wash your clothes at home, do you feel safe drinking it, etc. And then you calculate a score of this, and if the score is higher than 12, people are considered water insecure. So before Helene, what I found interesting is that the levels of water insecurity were pretty low, but among those with public water, 11% scored high on water insecurity, but the levels among well and spring users were lower, even though we can see, again, the benefits of treatment of community water systems. 3 weeks after the hurricane, you see a reversal of that, where 98% of those on public water expressed water insecurity. They really didn't have water. 56% of those on wells and 54% on springs were water insecure. And even 6 months after the hurricane, that feeling of insecurity about people's water in the public system really persisted. Remained a little bit elevated for those on wells, but had recovered much more. So Andrew mentioned that participating in the study did decrease people's worry, and so we did ask a question. Now that you have results, are you more or less worried about your water? The green is much less worried, the blue is somewhat less worried, yellow is same amount, gray somewhat more worried, and orange much more worried. So a few people were much more worried, but most people, I think, felt much better about their water. So my takeaway as an environmental engineer is we really should appreciate all the great work that engineers do to help people design treatment systems, and that there's a real need for this kind of engineering expertise to help out those with private systems. So contaminants were observed at lower levels in households with public water service, demonstrating these benefits, but these systems at the same time were trusted less than the private wells and springs. And I wanted to acknowledge a team. It was a big team. Everybody really donated their time, and we used what money we had for supplies. Here's Andrew with some of our team members at one of our community report back meetings. Rebecca Fry, I want to especially acknowledge her, my co-PI, head of the Superfund Research Program and chair of the Department of Environmental Sciences and Engineering at UNC Chapel Hill. RTI, Amari Walker Franklin and Emmanuel Sotzi, they analyzed samples for free for us for all of the emerging contaminants and also the metals. I'm sorry, not the metals. Sorry, just the emerging contaminants. No, you guys did the metals. So anyway, that's it. We're happy to take some questions. Okay, no time for questions. Okay. We're a little ahead of schedule, right? I think the 11 is, yeah, so we... Do you have any ideas where the lead was coming from? Most likely the plumbing. We'd like to go back again and take a look. But yes, it's most likely the plumbing.